Season 6 of the Missing Witches podcast is sponsored in part by Foxglove Farm. Go to Foxglove Farm, that's farm with a PH, like pharmacy.com, and use offer code MISSINGWITCHES when you sign up for your monthly subscription box of witchy delights. And sponsored by listeners like you. You who join our Patreon and come to our coven meetings. You who buy our book. Recommend it to your friends and review it online. We thank you. And if you love this episode, tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Genesis P-Orridge isn't easy to write about. An extremely prolific, variously pronounced transmedia artist and philosopher who, by design, changed course at will, projects expanding, contracting, abandoned when they got too popular. It's hard to boil down a life like Jen's, and I think that that's what Jen would have wanted. To exit the cheap flesh suitcase of the material world, and leave as legacy an undefinable life that defies catchphrase-worthy descriptions, maintaining, in life and death, what Jen called a state of flux. In 1976, though, Genesis P-Orridge was given a label that might stick. Conservative Member of Parliament Nicholas Fairbairn called Jen and the other members of their Coombe Transmissions Collective wreckers of civilization. Genesis was self-admittedly a big mouth and a fanatic by nature, so even at the time, without the benefit of the icon status that Jen would achieve later, this was taken as a compliment. "We were so proud," Jen told The Guardian many years later. "We had a flyer with that on it the very next day. The irony of it was that Sir Nicholas Fairbairn, the Tory MP who called us that, was involved in various sex scandals, and his mistress, a House of Commons secretary, tried to hang herself outside his office. It was classic British hypocrisy. Everything we were against. But Jen didn't want to just wreck society. Jen wanted to cut it up, rearrange it, expand and evolve past post-war British civility to uncover the power of ritual and protest disguised as music and art. Genesis describes much of their performance work not as shows or gigs, but as happenings. Approached in Coombe's early days by an art critic, Jen told him, "It's not art, it's just what we do." When the critic told Jen that he might be able to get the Coombe Collective an arts grant, something like £200, Jen was like, "Okay, it is performance art." This wasn't because Jen was a sellout, quite the opposite. So compelled to fuck with the status quo, be self-expressive and confrontational, Jen had never had a straight job. Right up until death, Jen never once had a regular job. But this lack of straight-laced employment didn't mean that Jen didn't work, and it wasn't because Jen was lazy. Again, quite the opposite. One of the tenets of the Temple of Psychic Youth, a project that took place between 1981 and 1991, in their The Psychic Bible, states, "The temple strives to end personal laziness and engender discipline, to focus the will on one's true desires." Jen was brilliant from youth, earning scholarships to top schools, but rejected the violently homogenous, abusive, militaristic environment of post-war British institutions. Jen dropped out of school and out of polite society, living in squats and getting the surname P-Orridge when one drunken housemate dubbingly declared, "That's all I ever see you eat, is porridge. P-Orridge." That, coupled with a party game from Jen's school days where a group of friends ascribed a book of the Bible to each one of them. Thus, Neil Megson, born 1950, died, and Genesis P-Orridge was born. Jen eventually legalized the name, but it was not the last time their name would change. When Jen met the great love of their life, Lady J. Breyer, the two both changed their names to Breyer P-Orridge. This gesture was only the beginning of their exploration into a shared identity. Jen wrote, I think changing names is a really potent form of magic. It's a technique for shedding a nostalgic connection. The question of whether it was possible to change a person's innate, established behaviors once the neural pathways had been reinforced by societal pressures was a conundrum that obsessed me. I was always seeking, and occasionally seeming to find, methods to rid a self of atrophied habits, redundant behaviors, and boundaries imposed from outside. A critical part of Jen's journey wasn't just the death in name of Neil Megson, but also an actual clinical mortal death. In their memoir, Non-Binary, which I should add tragically by my reading wasn't exactly finished when Jen died, again, for real this time of leukemia in 2020. But luckily for us in our rabbit hole, it seems like Jen said yes to every interview. So there are hundreds of hours to fall through on YouTube and across the web. Jen wrote, "In 1967, I died. I'd been on cortisone for about 10 years by then for asthma. As my teen years wore on, I began to feel I was managing my asthma better. Then when I was 17, my doctor said, 'You've not had an asthma attack for a couple years, you don't need to take cortisone anymore.' I went, 'Oh great,' because I thought I was going to be trapped into having to take these pills forever, which limited any fantasies of living on a desert island or in the middle of nowhere. I stopped taking the pills on a Friday. On Monday, my mother and sister heard a big thump, found me on the floor turning blue. I had gone into a coma." So at 17 years old, Jen was rushed to hospital and brought back from the brink of non-existence. The doctor said, "You could live a normal length life or you could drop dead any day. We just don't know." Jen wrote, "That really pissed me off. I was attached to the pharmaceutical industry now. If society collapsed, I'd go with it. But it reinforced the idea that I shouldn't put things off. I'd already been thinking that I wanted to live a life being creative, but so many people pressure you to put that off or delay it, get a degree or get a job and write poetry later, travel later. Now I knew every day was precious. When the doctor said I could drop dead at any time, that was the moment when I made the choice to do the things that I thought were really important first, rather than doing anything to suit someone else. It was the final trigger, the final motivation. It made all the decisions so much easier thereafter. Does this move me toward my dream self or not? If it didn't, I didn't need it." Jen concludes the story by remarking, "There would be no Genesis P-Orridge without the death of Neil Andrew Megson." And I should probably mention before we get too far that Genesis, along with Coombe member and throbbing Gristle bandmate Cozy Fanny Tootie, invented industrial music. To this day, by the likes of 9 Inch Nails' Trent Reznor, they are called the godparents of industrial music. Elephant in the room, Cozy claims that Jen was violent with her at times, threw a concrete brick at her head but missed, threatened her with a knife when she said they were breaking up. Jen denied this. I don't know the capital T truth, but Jen's whole drive was to take things too far, so I believe Cozy. I can say for sure that in their memoir, Non-Binary, Jen was super dismissive of Cozy's creative contribution to their projects. So much so that instead of discussing Cozy here, I'm going to dedicate a full episode to her and her work next year. Stay tuned for Missing Witches Season 7, where we'll read Cozy's memoir, Art, Sex, Magic, search for details, and give Cozy her due. I can say that violence was par for the course in Jen's young life. Jen was beat up constantly in school and in the street. I can say that my high school friends were regularly attacked by carloads of jocks, out punk hunting on weekends. Changes you. But with Jen, it brings me to a bigger question. One that I struggle with in my own life, when I read these stories, when I think about my family. At what point does the trauma we endured stop excusing the choices we make? When we look for these stories, it always hurts when we find what we call rot among the ancestors' bones. But it helps to remember that we aren't searching for perfect beings. We aren't searching for deities or gurus to follow. but muses to inspire us. Ideas that are bigger than mistakes. How many people can we name who experimented their way into an entirely new genre of music? Can you imagine such wild, creative, and magical beings capable of such a feat? Well, we here at Missing Witches don't have to imagine. We can add Jen and Cozy to our pantheon of real, magical people who actually existed and honestly changed the world through a combination of magic and art. And as tempting as it may be for me to turn this episode into an episode of music history, Throbbing Gristle is fucking mind-blowing. Jen's band Psychic TV is one of my all-time favorites. But we're looking for witch history, so I'll do my best to focus on Jen's works of magic, the occult, ritual, and ceremony. Though there is, of course, a ton of overlap, because everything for Genesis was a ritual, a ceremony, a vision quest, a psychic seeking, especially music and art. Jen said, "It has always been my belief that creation, the making of art in any medium or combination of mediums, is a holy act. To be an artist is as much a calling from and to the divine service as becoming a physician, nurse, priest, shaman, or healer." Jen also wrote, "If we don't end the idea of separation between everyday life and magical work, then we're going to be at the mercy of those who wish to control us. So for us, it's very much a political thing." Though Genesis P-Orridge may be remembered as an artist, a singer-songwriter, if Google is anything to go by, Jen is so much more than that. A cultural engineer, occult thinker, and magical seeker who I believe could someday surpass names like Aleister Crowley and go down in history as a preeminent occultist of the 20th century. Ad break! And
ad break, witches!
These ad breaks are sponsored by Missing Witches. We love you if you love us and you want to support us. There are lots of ways that you can do that. One of my personal favorites is our Patreon. There's always something going on the message board there, but specifically we do a monthly chat with those of our patrons who choose to join us, and it has been so rewarding for me. Risa, I think you can say the same thing.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just come join us. You'll see. You'll just be like, oh, I knew when I started listening to this podcast that I found my witch best friends, and there must be like a badass gang of them out there gathering somewhere in the dark. And you were right. And it's on Patreon. And our Patreon is pay what you can. So it's not like there's a tiered system or whatever. If you can afford $1 a month or whatever else, we will welcome you with open arms. And yeah, our Patreon circles, we just learn from each other, and they're rad, and you should come.
Yeah. And another excellent and exciting and thrilling to even say out loud way that you can support us is by buying our book, Missing Witches.
Oh yeah.
You can get a paper copy if you're like me and you like to fuck a book up when you read it with a lot of
same.
I like to dog ear. I have like a sigil system that I use to annotate my books, but also like a lot of times it just has to be an ebook because I know I'm going to want to search things. Sometimes I like an ebook. Also, it's available as an audio book, which Risa and I narrated ourselves. There are musical versions of the carols. Those are two great ways you can support us, through Patreon, through buying our book. You can review our book on your podcast, on your blog, on your social media, on Goodreads, on Amazon. And if you really love this episode, you can tip us at PayPal, paypal.me/missingwitches. Jen picked up a question from William Burroughs when the two met that would become a centerpiece of Jen's life. How do we short-circuit control? Jen had been a long-time fan of Burroughs and Brian Geison's cut-up philosophy/technique of creating literature and applied it to visual art, music, daily life, and eventually Jen's own body. Burroughs was a magician too, and I don't want to pass him by without retelling one of his spells. He had a problem with a local business, so Burroughs took his portable tape recorder and walked up and down the street in front of the business, recording the ambient sounds. He took those tape recordings home and ritually mixed them with violent noise. Then he returned to the street and continued his pacing while playing his sound hex creation. The rumor goes that the business closed, but even if it didn't, I just wanted you to have this idea of homemade spells and using what you're into. Tape recorders or flowers, knitting or rocks, and implementing that into your conjuration. I can picture Burroughs grumbling angrily to himself as his heels scuffed on the sidewalk, and I want it for all of us. Another central praxis for Jen was one picked up in a communal squat hippie collective called the Exploding Galaxy. The group's main focus was to disrupt the brainwashing of habits by unsettling everyday routines. Members weren't allowed to sleep in the same bed on consecutive nights or wear the same clothes on consecutive days. All the clothes were piled in a trunk and worn on a first-come, first-dressed basis. Every action or proposal was met with the group persisting, "Why? Why? Why?" Many people, likely myself included, couldn't handle this kind of constant scrutiny, but Jen thrived. It was the challenge that Jen was seeking and would inform much of their life. Almost inevitably, though, as we find with so many gurus, and why we have to question those who tell us what to do, Jen left the commune after a few months, when it was discovered that the rules about sleeping arrangements and collective agreements regarding the community coffer applied to everyone but the Exploding Galaxy's leader and his girlfriend. In the Psychic Bible, Jen wrote, "If our self-image is primarily based on the faulty, biased, prejudiced, and highly edited memory recordings of other people with their own agenda of who we are intended to become, as defined by this perceptual process of unnatural selection, then ways and tools that allow us to seize the means of perception become vital to our fight to construct a self, a character, an identity that is truly and independently our own." I got stuck on this for a hot minute. Seize the means of perception. Of course, we witches are often familiar with Marx, encouraging the workers to seize the means of production, or Marxist feminists, applying this idea to bodily autonomy and proclaiming seize the means of reproduction. But what does it mean to seize the means of perception? Let's break it down together. Perception, the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. Also, and perhaps more useful to our question, a way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something. So perception is not just seeing or hearing, but also understanding, how we process and internalize what we sense. And means, facilities and resources. So, if we reframe the question, it might sound like this. How do we take control of the resources that inform our understanding of ourselves and the world? I think the first step is critical thinking, critical awareness, an exploding galaxy of questions beginning with why, knowing that the answer we often get, because this is how we've always done it, is neither sufficient nor true. When we examine our witches, we find that there have always been iconoclasts, people who transgressed against the mythical norm, world changers. In the Psychic Bible, Jen wrote, "Accept nothing. Assume nothing. Always look further. Be open-eyed as well as open-minded. And don't kid yourself." The Temple of Psychic Youth, TOPY for short, was a network, a massive undertaking that began, as all things do, as an idea. There's an adorable video clip of Jen holding up their first record to the camera saying, "This is what happens to ideas sometimes." And I paused the video and looked around, and maybe for the first time, I recognized that every single thing I saw, my books, my house, my records, my furniture, my technology, my clothes, my food, every single thing began as an idea. Everything that was ever made by humans began as a spark of imagination. Ideas and imagination are epic currency, one that Jen spent freely. In the 1960s, a friend's mom asked what Jen's future plans were, and Jen replied, with an admitted teen arrogance, "I am going to take my daydreams very seriously." Topi was founded in the 80s without the internet, when networks were hard fought. The underground lived inside mail order, zines, independent record stores, fueled almost entirely by word of mouth. To put a fine point on it, I remember going to the bank in the early 90s to buy a money order to send away for a Velvet Underground t-shirt from a black and white Xeroxed catalog that was making the rounds among my friends. I took the GO train into the big city when I heard there was a store that sold Manic Panic hair dye. Before that, I used Jell-O powder. Being weird, finding people who were weird like you, was hard work back then, and Jen just wanted to make it easier. Carl Abramson was one of those weirdos seeking weirdos when he subscribed to the Topi newsletter. He would eventually set up a Scandinavian branch, what Topi called access points. TopiScan, which begat Topi Europe. In his book, Occulture, Carl wrote, "I immediately realized that Topi was something brand new. Everything I had read about magic and occultism always dealt with something old and arcane, systematically symbolic, and quite dusty. Not so with Topi. The core was one of sacralized free will, and an experimental technology was presented to root out bad habits, whether imposed by others or simply one's own, and generate change through, quite often, artistic means." In Genesis P-Orridge and the Rise of Industrial Paganism, Christopher Partridge wrote, "P-Orridge's interest was always less in the lure and romance of medieval magicians cloaked in robes and waving wands, and more in the apparent changing ability the human mind and activities actually have." Again, it is unsurprising to learn that P-Orridge is not a follower of particular occult traditions or particular pagan paths. Their concern was always to challenge tradition, question received ways of thinking, unravel established moralities, and subvert political and religious hegemonies. This paganism is free thinking, hard-headed esoterrorism. As esoterrorist, P-Orridge offers listeners an excavation of the heathen earth, an unveiling of a dark hinterland in which people are manipulated and deceived. Under the Topi banner, Carl and the many others, 10,000 active members at one count, in the network produced albums and books and films while also reissuing out-of-print titles, organizing protests, happenings, workshops and lectures, film screenings, group rituals, and magical workshops. Jen wrote, "Our desire is to inspire a new underground we all know exists. A new generation of nonconformists." I want to take a little tangent here. In Season 9 of RuPaul's Drag Race, Aja is given the role of Grandria Zuckerwoman in the parody skit 9021 Ho. Aja doesn't like the casting and protests. Alexis Michelle tells Aja, "You just gotta grow up and accept the challenge." Aja replies, "I don't have to." And though Aja comes off as a bit of a spoiled brat, I love the cadence of this delivery, and I love the message even more. When society tells you what you have to do, it's fair to question, do I though? Seize the means of your own perception and create a reality that fits you. When society says to me, you have to hate yourself because you're not ambitious, pretty, thin, rich, smart, young, normal enough. You have to buy these ideas and these products to fit in. I can say, I don't have to. And it's like Jen was told, you gotta finish school, get a job, and grind, upholding the state of affairs until, if you're lucky, you retire at 65, possibly enjoy your life for 5 or 10 years, if you have any energy left for your passions, and then die, having successfully left the boat unrocked. And it's like Jen replied, I don't have to, but there is a price. Spoiler alert, Aja went home that week. Genesis lived without running water for like a lot of their life. Comfort was a sacrifice made by choice. What would we do with more money? Jen once asked. We'd just use it to make more art. But like many witches, Genesis was also hunted by the great protectors of the status quo, and in 1975 was arrested and stood trial for obscenity. The crime involved collage art postcards that Jen had made and mailed to some friends, part of a process that Jen and others called correspondence art. Genesis went to court and was found not guilty, due in part, they say, to a voodoo doll which had been given to them by a practitioner friend who instructed Jen to place it under the jury box. In 1992, Scotland Yard raided Jen's family home and seized 2 tons of archived material, claiming that Jen had participated in satanic abuse. For the record, there was no truth in this. No actual charges were laid. Amid the satanic panic, a friend of Jen's had made a film that was deemed satanic. So that provided another great excuse to hunt a witch. While Jen was in Kathmandu, using their life savings to help Tibetan monks build a well, for real, that's what Jen was doing at the time, using their life savings to help Tibetan monks build a well. All of Jen's possessions, including their entire archive, was seized by Scotland Yard, never to be returned. It's worth noting that less than 20 years later, in 2009, Tate Britain acquired Jen's rebuilt archives. Less than 20 years passed between Jen's possessions being labeled criminal and them being labeled important art history. And this is exactly why we need to question the status quo. Harriet Tubman went from outlaw to American hero. Genesis went from obscene to important. They themselves did not change. Their stories remained the same, but what has changed is the means of perception. What changed was how polite society perceived Harriet and Jen, and pretty much every single witch we've profiled on the pod. But Jen did have some run-ins with conventionality. Jen married a woman named Paula, and they had 2 daughters, Caress and Janess, who appear on many PTV records, audio and video, and continue to carry on the legacy of their mystical departed parent. Janess still runs Jen's now posthumous Instagram account, which you can follow at Pandragine. So, the Pandragine Project. In August of 1993, Genesis P-Orridge met Lady J. Breyer, and according to Jen, it was love at first sight. Not just love, devotion, awareness. A message from the universe, a psychic knowledge that this woman would change Jen's life forever. And it's almost funny that Jen's life of nonconformity and wrecking of civilization would bring them to, of all places, a love story. Lady J was a nurse and a dominatrix in New York, and referred to her body as a cheap suitcase, sometimes a flesh suitcase, that her spirit felt trapped in. Jen was a lifelong occultist and had grown up with terrible asthma, so they too had a hyper sense of the limitations of the human body. Jen wrote, "A trans person might feel like a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body. The Pandragine just feels trapped in a body. We don't believe in any either-or maps of reality or behavior, never have. Improvising, exploration, pressing one's own limits. That's how we discover what might really be going on. Cut up everything. Body, mind, flesh, identity, relentlessly break and short-circuit any form of control you can reveal or locate." So Jen and Jay were in love. They combined their lives and their names, started using the pronoun we. They dressed in each other's clothes, and made tons of art together. But that wasn't far enough for the likes of Jen and Jay. The Breyer P-Orridges had their first Pandragine surgeries in 2003. The idea was to become one in every sense they could imagine. So the two began altering their faces and bodies to resemble each other, like rhinoplasty and, for Jen, breast implants. Jen wrote, "Pandrogyny, we've felt ever since the mid-1980s, is inevitable. It's part of the evolution of human species, and it's not finished. Evolution is a long-term process that keeps going. Mutations happen, sometimes slowly and sometimes suddenly. A pressure to a sudden, radical evolutionary mutation is building. The aging old guard are resisting with ever more blatant strategies culled from shameful, internecine conflicts of their past. Thousands of years of slaughter in war, oppression of anything other. at the expense of the thinkers, proponents of change, philosophers, artists, and of course, radical, ethnic, religious, and sexual variants. They say, deviants. Jen and Jay continued making art and music, becoming one, falling deeper in love. Then, in 2007, Lady J suffered an acute heart arrhythmia, and she died in Jen's arms. The New York Times reported her death left Genesis alone, one half of an art project that no longer had a second half. Jen grieved, like any of us might, but with the comfort of knowing that a spiritual life awaited them both. And in Jen's grief, a friend suggested that they take a trip to Benin, which became the documentary Bite of the Twin. Okay, side note here, I read a reference to this doc, so naturally I went looking for it. The only place you can stream this doc is, for real, the Satanic Temple TV network. So I thought, awesome! It's well worth a 1-month subscription to watch this film and check out what the other video offerings Satanic Temple TV might hold. So I signed up, and I'll be damned, but I couldn't get their player to work. I ended up exchanging a few emails with a lovely staff member and got a refund, but I've still never seen the film. So I'll share with you some of the text from the film's webpage, but if any of you out there have access to this doc, please help a witch out. I still really want to see it. Bite of the Twin tells the story of Genesis Breyer P-Orridge and the Los Angeles-based artist and filmmaker Hazel Hill McCarthy III's journey to Ouida in Benin to explore the origins of the Vodun religion. Transcending assumptions of what it means to be gendered, Genesis Breyer P-Orridge and late wife Lady J underwent a series of surgical procedures to become physically identical to one another, seeking to perfect a gender-neutral state through a process they termed pandrogyny. In 2007, J unexpectedly died. Genesis has maintained the concept of the pandragine and continues to self-reference in the plural we. As Genesis puts it, since Lady J dropped her body, she is the half of the pandragine in the immaterial world, with Genesis being the half in the material world. Still connected, making a whole. This path is both a brutal and loving one for Genesis, and they are constantly battling the hardship, grief, and pitfalls of devoting one's life to art and love in such a drastic way. Hazel Hill McCarthy III, longtime friend and collaborator in hopes of keeping Genesis positive and active, suggests a trip to Ouida, Benin, the birthplace of Vodun, to work on a project together, exploring the relationship between Vodun and Western performance art. Upon their arrival, they discover a radical connection between Genesis's life and artistic practice, and one of the world's oldest religions. Benin has the highest national average of twins per birth in the world, so it's not surprising that twins carry a sacred meaning. Twins there are venerated as gods, and we learn through the film's many twin stories when one twin passes away, the living twin remembers its spirit by carrying around a small carved replica of their dead brother or sister, called a jumeau. In Benin, it is never said that a twin dies. Rather, it is said that they have gone to the forest to look for wood. Beginning as an investigation, the nature of the project changes drastically when Genesis is serendipitously initiated into the twin fetish, a ritual in which there is an activation of a dead twin's spirit in order to allow for the living one to remain connected with the one who has passed, emerging back to a whole. Genesis, through this ancient religion, sees a way to reconnect with the spirit of their deceased wife and dives in. As the film progresses, we begin to see the link between pandrogyny and the twin fetish. Ultimately, during shooting, the nature of the film changed from simply being a catalyst for audiences to gain a wider understanding and acceptance of Vodun, to being itself Vodun, an object that has been activated by creation. And I like to think of this as a spiritual gift from the mystical universe to Genesis, to unwittingly, coincidentally travel halfway around the world to find a culture and a practice that could reunite them with their great love. One of Jen's final shows was 2016's Try to Alter Everything. That's altar, like ceremonial sacred space, ALTAR. Alter everything. Jen told Dazed magazine, "It really does sum up a lot of what we do. Taking things that are already around and reassembling them to inject them with something special, an energy or resonance that speaks to you in a way you wouldn't expect. This is the way we witches, I think, can seize the means of perception. By trying to alter everything. Recognize the ideas behind objects and behaviors. Create nonconformist networks that recognize the sacred energy of all things." Jen went to the forest to look for wood and found leukemia. They dropped their cheap suitcase and rejoined Lady J in 2020. As we witches head into our holiday season, into this season of death, let's borrow a mission statement from Genesis P-Orridge to ponder as the leaves and empires fall around us. Our mission is to fall through the cracks of stale tradition every hour of life, to find the places and sounds no one has dared think of, to have real faith in oneself in an age when the white noise of conformity has never been turned up higher is no easy task, but everyone has the potential to do it. Discard all inherited value systems and social conditioning, end gender, break sex, destroy the control of DNA and the expected. Our daily mission is to subvert, seeking and fighting to answer Burroughs' challenge. How do we short-circuit control? Please, go out and try to change the fucking world. Try to alter everything.
You must be a witch.
Season 6 of the Missing Witches podcast is sponsored in part by Foxglove Farm. Go to Foxglove Farm, that's farm with a PH, like pharmacy.com, and use offer code MISSINGWITCHES when you sign up for your monthly subscription box of witchy delights. And sponsored by listeners like you. You who join our Patreon and come to our coven meetings. You who buy our book, recommend it to your friends, and review it online. We thank you. And if you love this episode, tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches.